joining us today. Victoria Beal with the LTAP Center. We're very pleased to be working with our partners in the HR section on today's topic of human trafficking training. Just a quick housekeeping item, and then I'm going to turn things over to Tracy Lures. In the questions box of the GoToWebinar panel, please put your questions in while our presenter, Tara Alston, is speaking. We're going to have questions addressed at the end, but we would love for you to pose them as we're going, so that way we capture what you're thinking and what you have questions about. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Tracy Lures.
Okay. Thank you so much, Victoria. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Bridging the Gap. This is a platform that we have to educate, share experiences, and provide insight that may be beneficial to our professional and our personal lives. As Victoria said, I'm Tracy Lures, and along with Tanya Todd, she and I serve as co-chairs of the All Volunteer Committee. And you will be hearing from Tara Alston. And just a little bit about Tara. She is a program administrator at the Ohio Department of Transportation, of course, an agency on the governor's Ohio Human Trafficking Task Force. She is also a survivor and author who dedicates much of her time to providing awareness to subjects pertaining to trauma, such as human trafficking, and with the goal of prevention. And in this case, preventing human trafficking from becoming part of another story, and also with the goal of identifying human trafficking with the hopes of reaching victims of this horrific type of crime. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tara. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tracy.
Tara, we lost your PowerPoint and you. Okay, now we're starting to see the PowerPoint again.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I once knew of a 2-year-old boy who was sold by his mother to her drug dealer, who could not pay for her drugs and allowed the drug dealer to do whatever he wanted to the little boy in exchange for the drugs. I also once knew a man who was promised a good job with livable wages. When he arrived, the job was nothing like what he was told. He was paid very little, and they demanded him to work 12 hours a day. There were threats of hurting his family if he did not comply. He didn't feel as though he could leave the job and keep his family safe. I also knew of a young girl forced by her stepfather to create child sexual abuse material, which he sold for profit. She later ended up in another situation of human trafficking in adulthood, as many young victims do. I was that young girl. Welcome to Human Trafficking in Ohio Training. As it was mentioned, I am Tara Alston. I'm the Anti-Human Trafficking Program Administrator here at Ohio Department of Transportation. This is disturbing and potentially triggering content. So please, if you feel triggered in any way, feel free to take a break, step away for a few moments, give yourself some time. It is important that you're taking care of yourself during training like this. I do like to go over some myths versus facts in training with the goal of debunking the myths. I'm sure that many people have heard the stories going around social media that talk about the white van in the Target parking lot. And it's not that that can't happen, but that is one of the things that's spread around social media, and that's not often how it looks here. So myths versus facts. Human trafficking does not occur in the United States. It only happens in other countries. If you could use the chat box and reply whether you think that is myth versus fact. The reason that we look at these types of things is because if we're looking for the wrong things perpetuated by these myths, then we'll miss the opportunities to identify trafficking as it often occurs. Victoria, do we happen to have any answers?
We do. And it's a solid myth for everybody who's responded so far.
Very good. Yes, it is a myth. So why is this training important? You may be asking that question now, or maybe you thought about it a little bit before you registered. We are each in a unique position to make an impact in the fight against human trafficking. And we can do that with knowledge of how to identify and report human trafficking if we potentially see an instance of that. Today, we're going to be going over understanding the crime of human trafficking, its signs and indicators, how to respond if you potentially see a situation, the impacts of human trafficking, and then Ohio's response to human trafficking. Understanding the crime. First, we're going to go over the federal legal definitions of human trafficking. These are very wordy. Don't worry, we will break it down a little bit as we go along, so it'll be quite understandable as we go. But according to the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, sex trafficking is defined as a commercial sex act induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act has not attained 18 years of age. A commercial sex act is any sexually oriented action done in exchange for anything of value. So when we talk about sexually oriented actions, that could be sex acts, explicit photos, exotic dancing, things of that nature. When we talk about anything of value, people immediately typically think of money. And while that can be anything of value, it could also be food or a place to stay, drugs, safety of a loved one. So anything that is valued by someone is anything of value. How trafficking occurs. In the United States, we look at what is considered the AMP method. So there's an action, means, and a purpose in order for it to be considered human trafficking. The actions, they pull those from the definitions that we talked about. So the actions could be recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, obtaining, patronizing, soliciting, or advertising. And some of that is pulled from the sex trafficking definition. And then some of it is pulled, I don't think I even touched on the labor trafficking definition. So with labor trafficking, that's where they pulled the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. So we talk about those actions that are done, and then the means would be through force, fraud, or coercion, and for the purpose of commercial sexual exploitation or forced labor. The only exemption to that is if a victim is under the age of 18 and they have an instance of commercial sex. So if commercial sex has occurred, or a commercial sex act has occurred and the victim is under the age of 18, force, fraud, or coercion does not have to be proven in order for it to be human trafficking. So let's dive into force, fraud, and coercion and what that actually means. When people think about human trafficking, they typically picture what falls under force. So that's the physical assaults, sexual assaults, confinement. Maybe sometimes people get the picture of somebody being in chains. And then there's fraud. That's an act of deception with criminal intent. So in one of those stories that I told you in the beginning, the individual who had been told about a job came to work, the tasks were different, the pay was not what he was told, and that whole story falls under fraud because they brought him to this working situation with the intent to labor traffic him through fraud. So they told him it was going to be one thing and it was completely different. Now that story also has some coercion in it. So coercion is threats of serious harm against any person, whether it's that person or a person that another person, or the abuse or threatened abuse of the legal process. So with that, they were threatening to harm his family if he didn't comply. So that story also includes coercion as the means of trafficking. So to break this down into something that's a little easier to remember, human trafficking is a crime in which people profit from the control and exploitation of others. Let's talk about the nature and scope of human trafficking. It is a multi-billion-dollar criminal industry. There's an estimated 27.6 million people globally that are thought to be trafficked, according to the International Labor Organization. Out of those 27.6 million, 21 million are estimated to be victims of labor trafficking, and 6.6 million people are estimated to be victims of sex trafficking. I have this picture here because a lot of people don't think about how we are involved when it comes to the exploitation of people. We are consumers of many different products. One product that I am giving an example of here is coffee. I don't know how many people enjoy coffee like I do, but that is a product that is often consumed. There's about 20% of children who are in coffee growing countries that fall victim to labor exploitation and coffee cultivation. So that's just one of many examples of the things that we consume that can include child or forced labor. Human trafficking is the fastest growing and second largest criminal industry in the world. It's only surpassed by drug trafficking. The reason why is trafficking criminals have realized that you can only sell a drug one time, but you can sell a victim, whether that's a man, a woman, a girl, or a boy, over and over and over again. I like to look at statistics before I do trainings, and something that really caught my eye around the pandemic was the information that was gathered during that time period. They had found that the number of detected victims fell for the first time in 20 years as that pandemic hit. Sex trafficking was less detected during the pandemic, and trafficking convictions slowed down during the pandemic. But they found that more highly organized traffickers exploited more victims, more violently, and for longer periods of time. There's a reason for this, and I'm sure you might be wondering. The isolation and the lack of community members being out and about and being able to look out for one another really prevented people from being able to see if something just didn't seem right when they were out and communicating and seeing different people in the community. Where do you think that Ohio ranks in the nation with reported cases to the National Human Trafficking Hotline? It will be numbers 1 through 50. So where do you think that Ohio ranks? Go ahead and put that in the chat.
Okay, we're getting responses of 12, 10 in the top 10%, top 10 worst, 37, first, 40th, 5th, 7th, 3rd, 9th.
That's a lot of answers.
2nd, 4th, yeah.
We are 8th. So we rank 8th in the nation with the number of reported cases to the Human Trafficking Hotline. I do want to explain that that does not necessarily mean that we have the 8th highest number of cases. This is just identified cases that have been reported to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. One positive in this sense is that in Ohio, we're doing a great job of spreading awareness about human trafficking, what to look for, what to do if you potentially see a case of human trafficking. So we are making calls to the National Human Trafficking Hotline for help. So being 8th in the nation, although we would prefer that there were no cases to report, it is nice to know that Ohioans are realizing what can be done to help. You can see here that California is number 1, Texas 2, Florida 3. And as you go down the list, there's not very much difference between the 5th and the 8th. There's just a few numbers different between each level. So that is not a huge jump. But I wanted to make sure that you're aware that this is only a snapshot, because there is no one repository for all the human trafficking data. There are lots of individual ones, and then there are some places that never report the cases that are identified for trafficking. So this is a very small snapshot of what is out there. And I do like to also point out that Ohio has the 5th largest interstate system in the nation. So that makes it easier for traffickers to transport victims to and from where they would traffic them. Transportation does not have to take place for it to be human trafficking, but they do often use our transportation systems to transport them during the trafficking. According to the International Labor Organization in 2021, 80% of trafficking was labor trafficking. But in the United States, the reported labor trafficking cases to the hotline only accounted for 30%. So we are realizing that we are missing instances of labor trafficking. And we've talked about and tried to figure out how are we missing these cases. Well, most people think of sex trafficking when they hear the word trafficking. So they're not even looking for situations of potential labor trafficking. But there's also reasons why labor trafficking might be a little harder to be identified. Oftentimes it's hidden in plain sight. So that's trafficking as a whole. It can happen in homes or businesses where things could be more isolated. There's residential sex trafficking. There could be domestic work, personal sexual servitude, construction or landscaping occurring, and it looks like legitimate businesses with construction, landscaping, the farming. There's lots of business models here that I have listed. There's 25 of them that have been identified that human traffickers use. Yes, they use business models. And many of these business models look like legitimate businesses. So, you may be surprised to find out that there is trafficking occurring in some of these business models, while others may not surprise you as much. Talk about who's involved in this crime. So here we have a story from Ohio where there was a Dayton roofing company owner who pled to federal charges. Traffickers are anyone who uses force, fraud, or coercion to exploit another person for profit. So they could look like the stereotypical pimp that you may get a vision in your head from seeing movies or shows that have depicted traffickers or pimps. But don't forget that the stories from the beginning, we had parents, business owners. We've also seen ministers, doctors, attorneys, and many, many more. This is not an all-inclusive list. It's important to also understand that it's not just men who are the traffickers. There are women, there are children, there are gangs that are also trafficking other people. Myth versus fact. Human trafficking victims can be any age, race, gender, or nationality. Go ahead and put it in the chat.
They're
With
saying
any answers?
fact, true, yes.
Yes, it
true.
is a fact. Thanks, Victoria. So in 2020, just over half of the victims of federally prosecuted cases. So again, we don't have one place where all the data is kept for human trafficking cases, but these were specific federally prosecuted cases. Just over half of the victims were children, with victims' ages ranging between 4 and 17 years old when they were exploited. I want you to think about that age, focus on that as I give you this next statistic. An average sex trafficking victim is forced to have sex 20 to 48 times per day. 45.1% of the victims knew their trafficker prior to becoming a victim. Trafficking disproportionately affects vulnerable people. There are vulnerabilities to victimization. There is also an understanding that most of us have faced some sort of vulnerabilities in our life. So as we go through these, this is not an all-inclusive list either. It's just to start thinking about how people can become vulnerable. And having vulnerabilities in your life makes you vulnerable to human trafficking. So a victim could be anybody. You could have experienced abuse, whether that's domestic abuse or sexual abuse prior to, have a history of that. You could have a physical or mental health issue. So you could have a disability, you could have a substance use disorder. You may not have basic needs met. So you could have an unstable living situation or be facing poverty or some sort of economic need. Maybe you're lacking connection. You could be a foreign national, whether documented or undocumented, it doesn't matter. Once you come to another country, that connection and that community could be lacking. Maybe you were a part of the foster care system, maybe LGBTQ plus. So victims could be girls, boys, women, or men. A lot of times people immediately think of women as the victims of trafficking, but again, there's no demographic profile for a victim of human trafficking. We are going to be touching on, you all had received a handout prior to this training, and we will be touching on that here shortly as well. But that also ties into vulnerabilities to victimization. And so we'll be discussing those adverse childhood experiences in just a bit. Myth versus fact. Human trafficking victims must be held captive with chains, locks, etc. Go ahead and put it in the chat.
Everybody's saying myth. There's a bunch of responses.
That's correct. So here in the United States, trafficking most often occurs in the context of a relationship. So it typically involves some sort of grooming and then force, fraud, and coercion, like we talked about before. With grooming, human traffickers look at this like an investment. What they do is they look for people and watch people to determine what needs they have that are not being met. So they target victims. They meet those needs temporarily, whether it's a place to live, providing food, maybe some clothes, maybe it's drugs, but they're providing for some need, and then they turn around and exploit them. And as we look at who the traffickers are, we looked at some being a significant other, some being a friend, parent, caregiver, employer. They all build some sort of relationship with the potential victim. So that way they're building that trust, and then they turn around and exploit them later. Who are the buyers? They could look like any of us. So your neighbors, teachers, attorneys, doctors, politicians, police officers, ministers. There was a recent bust that included government contractors who had security clearances, elected US officials, military officers, scientists, you name it, they can be a buyer. You may wonder why it's important for us to even talk about the buyers. That is because, just as with any other business, there would not be a business without there being buyers. So in reducing demand, we also reduce exploitation. I know many of us have been hearing a lot about the Epstein files lately, so that can cause your mind to be thinking about the different potential buyers, potential victims, potential traffickers as well. But one thing you'll notice is the traffickers and buyers are often somebody who they feel has some type of authority, or they may be well liked in the community, or they might just supposed to be trustworthy type of folks. So that's how they utilize their positions a lot of times within somebody's life in order to build that trust. Myth versus fact. Human trafficking doesn't happen in my town.
We're getting a big bunch of myths put in here.
That's exactly right. It's a myth. As of 2021, the largest human trafficking sting that we've had in Ohio history, there were 161 arrested across 17 different communities for seeking to buy sex. Among those buyers, there was a firefighter, a college professor, and a councilman. There were 10 minors who were recovered who had been reported missing, and then there were 51 women who were provided with assistance by social service advocates. Here's an instance of labor trafficking in Ohio. This was in Cleveland. A woman with a cognitive disability who had a child was held captive and trafficked. The traffickers forced her to live in the basement with pit bulls and pythons. You heard that correctly. It was pit bulls and pythons. She was beaten, threatened with attack by the animals, and forced into slavery. They forced her to do work around the house. They had sexually assaulted her. They were causing her physical harm. They'd take her to the hospital. She'd get prescriptions for the pain and things that she was experiencing, but then they would take her prescription drugs and they wouldn't let her have them. They were also stealing her food stamp benefits. They said that she had the mental capacity of a 13 to 14-year-old. And so to get help, she thought, let me steal this candy bar when they were out in public at one point with the hope of being arrested. And that's exactly what happened. And that is how her situation of trafficking was discovered. Here's examples of sex trafficking in Ohio. Of course, there can be non-related individuals who are traffickers who traffic victims. But with these youngest kids who are being trafficked, they're often being trafficked by their own families. So people think about the danger of, kids who run away, the runaways, the danger that they're putting themselves in because, statistically, it is very dangerous. Runaway children will be approached within 48 hours at a very high rate by traffickers. But we also need to be looking at and thinking about what are they running away from? Are they running away from a very bad situation that they're experiencing at home? We're going to talk about some of the signs and indicators of trafficking. We do have concerns with sharing signs and indicators because it's impossible for us to create an all-inclusive list. And we also don't want the examples given used like a checklist, but it does help your mind think about evaluating this as a big picture. So looking at the picture as a whole, if you see something that just doesn't seem right, it probably isn't, whether that's trafficking or not. You don't have to be sure that trafficking is occurring. If you see something that doesn't seem right, say something, report it, because those who are trained will handle it from there. So some of the observable signs that you'll see outwardly, there could be physical signs. So maybe there's signs of neglect or abuse. You could have a child who's talking about working long hours and just experiencing a lot of exhaustion. Somebody could appear to be dressed very differently or have a different level of hygiene than what you expect, or maybe they don't have the safety gear for the type of work that they're performing. There was a recent bust where in Columbus, there were individuals who were working on a roof on a home, and a neighbor nearby noticed that they did not seem to be dressed for that work at all, not appropriately for the safety. And so they had reached out and made a report, and it was found that it was an instance of labor trafficking. So just being aware of these things can make a huge difference in the lives of these victims. They could have tattoos. Traffickers often like to what they call brand their victims. It's a show of ownership. So maybe you see a number of people who have the same tattoo and that they may all be quote unquote owned by the same trafficker. Or maybe it's an abnormal tattoo that you see. That could be an example of branding. They could appear to live at their place of employment, so working and living in the same place. Or an obvious one, they could appear to be involved in prostitution. Emotionally, you may see some signs. They could seem overly anxious or fearful. Maybe they seem combative. If you think about the people who are listed as, people in power who may have trafficked them or may have bought them previously, and then you have people coming up trying to do something that they think is helpful, but these individuals are afraid because they don't know who to trust. So they may seem combative rather than welcoming help like you would expect. They often avoid eye contact. There is a rule in trafficking where you are not to make eye contact with someone else because then that person owns you rather than your current trafficker. So this is an instance where if somebody is not making eye contact with you as they are talking with you, it may not be that they are being untruthful. It may be that they are afraid of making eye contact due to that rule. They could talk of owing someone. So we talked a little bit about the grooming process and, you know, people looking at the needs that are not being met by potential victims and then meeting those needs temporarily and then turning around and exploiting them. Well, a lot of times these traffickers will be like, I did all of this for you. Now you owe me. So they may talk of owing someone as well. Maybe it's knowledge that doesn't seem to make sense. So it may appear that they are extremely knowledgeable about something, such as there was a story about kids who were trafficked here in Ohio at a chicken farm. And they were extremely knowledgeable about debeaking and vaccinating chickens. That is not normal knowledge for children. So having that extreme knowledge about something that just doesn't quite make sense. Or maybe it's somebody that doesn't have a lot of knowledge about where they're located. Because a lot of times people are moved around to be trafficked in different locations. So they may not seem knowledgeable enough about where they currently are. You could see evidence of control. So there could be an older adult who doesn't seem to be a parent with a child that seems uncomfortable. There could be different adults other than the guardians picking up kids from school. You know, maybe you go to your child's school line, pickup line, and you're just noticing something strange like that, like different people are picking up somebody all the time. They could appear to be being monitored by another person when talking to or interacting with others. So maybe that person is like really watching and really listening in to what they're saying, or maybe they're not letting them speak for themselves at all. Maybe somebody else is speaking up on their behalf. They could have well-rehearsed or inconsistent stories, because as you're moved around and told to say different things, things eventually start getting mixed up. They may not have control of their own identifying documents or money. Traffickers like to take identifying documents, whether that's your birth certificate, social security card, passport, visa. They take these things because if you don't have any of those identifying documents and you try to leave, it is extremely difficult to be able to start from nothing in getting those documents. So if you don't have a birth certificate, it's going to be hard for you to get a social security card. So they take that as another form of control. And you can't really do much without those identifying documents, such as get a job, find a place to live. So it really limits what you can do. Maybe somebody's coming home, one of your children's coming home, or you notice somebody that is coming different places that has unexplained gifts, like there's really expensive gifts or a lot of gifts that they're coming home with and there's no explanation for that. That can be part of that grooming process as well, where they're trying to meet needs, build trust, and sometimes they'll, you know, do the romance part where they're trying to give these grand gifts to build that trust. So that's another thing just to watch for. Or maybe they're constantly checking their phone because if they're away from their trafficker may be tracking them and contacting them through this phone. And then there's people who like to talk about what signs and indicators there may be at homes and businesses, because sometimes people go into homes and businesses as part of their job, or maybe it's just as you're out and about, and what can you look for that might stand out? There could be an unusual number of people going in and out of a property. So let's say that's even a neighbor's house. That's something to keep an eye on. Property owner attempts to keep you out of a portion of the home or business. So I've trained real estate folks that have talked about how they have gone into a place to do assessments and things like that. And the property owner is trying to keep them out of this certain section. Well, that doesn't make sense. Something is not okay. There could be tenants or guests of the home or business who lack knowledge of the neighborhood or area. We touched on that a little bit. Maybe there's unusual locks on interior doors and or windows. So maybe you notice things like reverse doorknobs on the doors or reverse locks on the outside of windows, or maybe you notice a lot of cameras. You know, we think about security systems being set up to keep bad guys out, keep us safe. But in situations of trafficking, these are used to keep victims from being able to get help. Maybe there's unsuitable living or working conditions that you notice, or maybe, like we said before, they appear to even be living in their workplace. So there are challenges, even though we can go over signs and indicators, there are challenges to identifying victims, and this is not an all-inclusive list either. The very nature of the crime, it's a hidden crime, it's done oftentimes in isolation, so you really have to be able to be aware of your surroundings as you're going out and about throughout your day in order to be able to pick up on any of these red flags at times. And sometimes it's not even possible. And then abusers and traffickers often make victims feel as though they are to blame for what is happening to them. So then they feel shame. Or like we talked about, you know, there may be what's considered debt bondage from that time of grooming where their needs are getting met, the gifts are getting given. So then the trafficker turns around and says, now you owe me this. And so they feel honor bound to pay those debts. Or maybe there's a trauma bond with the trafficker, and that is a completely different training. That's an in-depth situation that often occurs. They could face a lot of fear because traffickers coach their victims through threats and often violence. There are individuals that I know that have actually witnessed other victims be shot in front of them, so that when the trafficker is telling you, I will do this to you if you don't comply, they know that it is a real threat. It's not just something that they're imagining, that fear. Victims are often fearful of harm to themselves and or their families, like we talked about in those initial stories. There could be a mistrust of authorities. Again, if you remember who we have as traffickers and who we have listed as buyers, you know, that causes a lot of mistrust with people that should be able to be trusted for help. Could be a lack of understanding by the community. So if we're looking for things that aren't actually happening in our community, like the white van in the Target parking lot being the prime example, then we're missing the potential to identify victims. There could be language barriers. An average victim of sex trafficking has an expectancy of 7 years after the start of their exploitation. And the odds of escaping human trafficking are 1 in 100, so 1%. So how do we respond? So we've gone over some of the signs and indicators. We're getting some ideas about things to look for. How you show up in your community from day to day makes a big difference. Being kind, being a friendly face, making people feel seen, safe, and cared about. If you have the opportunity to ask questions, if something just doesn't seem right, you can ask things like, are you all right? Is anyone making you do something that you're uncomfortable doing? Are you or someone you care about being threatened in any way? Do not ask them if they're a victim of human trafficking. Most have likely not even heard that term, and most do not identify as a victim of human trafficking. Many of us don't identify for years after exploitation has ended. It takes time to break apart what you've actually experienced and be able to identify that as human trafficking once you've learned more and gone through some of the healing process. If you see something, say something. So if your organization has protocols in place, that's definitely something that you want to follow. If you see a crime in progress or someone seems to be in immediate danger, call 911. If you suspect that you may see a potential issue of human trafficking, but you don't know, there doesn't seem to be an immediate thing happening, but it just doesn't seem right, you can always call or text the National Human Trafficking Hotline. I have their information here for you. I suggest personally texting "be free," and then you can put help or info in the body of the message. You get a quicker response that way. So you can do this anonymously, so you don't have to provide your contact information, your name, and they will send people out who are trained for the situation and being able to work through that, determine if trafficking is taking place, get help for victims, things like that. Don't approach the traffickers. This could be dangerous for you and may also put the victim in more danger. What information would you try to gather to report? That's just like any other crime. As much information as you possibly can gather safely, you can do that. It's helpful to have as much information as possible. So time and location. If there's many individuals, being able to provide the number of individuals that you see, maybe some of the descriptions. If there's a vehicle included, getting a license plate number or a description or picture of the vehicle. If there's movement involved, whether that's in a vehicle or they're walking a certain direction, getting that direction that they're going is also helpful for emergency services to be able to come in and help. Again, only get what is safely to get. If there is any potential of you putting yourself in danger or maybe them realizing what you're doing, don't do that. So what are some of the impacts of trafficking? We call trafficking the life. So when they talk about being in the life or out of the life, they're referring to trafficking. So they're out of the life, we've identified them, emergency services have come. Now what? Like, there is definitely effects from all of this trauma. And we sent out the Adverse Childhood Experiences Score questionnaire, and that's where this comes in. There was a study done between 1995 and 1997. There were over 17,000 adults involved in the study, and it was really foundational to demonstrating the relationship between childhood trauma and future adult health and social complications. There were 10 types of trauma that was addressed in this study. There were 3 types of abuse, so that was physical, emotional, and sexual. There were 2 types of neglect, including physical and emotional, and then 5 types of dysfunction within the household as a child. So parental separation, domestic violence, substance abuse, mental illness, and incarceration. If you had the opportunity to take that, you can take a look at what your score was, and we'll discuss some of that. If you did not, it is in the handouts in the GoToMeeting, so feel free to download that. But I wanted to point out here that the higher scores correlate with higher risk of poor health and social outcomes. Approximately 2/3 of the participants reported at least one ACE, and many reported more than that in this study. Higher scores are associated with higher rates of substance misuse and higher risk sexual behavior. We talked about the vulnerabilities to trafficking, and in the examples that we gave, we talked about needs that weren't being met. We talked about things that are considered household dysfunction. We talked about a history of abuse, whether that's sexual abuse, physical abuse. So we talked about those things, and we talked about them being vulnerabilities to becoming a victim of trafficking. And now we're looking at this questionnaire that helps us see these vulnerabilities kind of in real time. Scores from 0 to 1, they say don't have the tools to truly understand the effects of the experiences of trafficking. There's low to no exposure to childhood trauma. 2 to 3 can relate a little bit. There's a moderate level of adverse childhood experiences, and it's considered an intermediate risk for toxic stress. 4 or more is tied to an increased risk of disease and social and emotional problems. 6 or more, there's an at risk of your lifespan being shortened by 20 years. At 7, the individual is most likely going to be trafficked if they have not already been. And then scores 8, 9, and 10, there's a high exposure to childhood trauma, elevated risk for severe adult health issues such as chronic disease, mental health challenges, and reduced lifespan. The toxic stress endured can alter the brain development and affect memory, emotional regulation, and decision making. The individual has most likely been trafficked by family and lived in survival mode at those scores. I scored a 9. Now, why this tool does not predict the future, it is used to determine risks and then used to prepare a plan of healing. Why we talk about this and why we like to go over this during human trafficking training is because we all have our own experiences. It helps us relate to other people and their situations, even if they're not the same experiences. So in identifying signs and indicators, for instance, we may all have different experiences that cause us to look at some of those signs and indicators a certain way without understanding how these adverse childhood experiences impact people. And the higher the score, sometimes you're going to see much bigger impact, and they might not be acting or talking in the way that you're expecting somebody to if you go to offer help. And then if you think about emergency services, police and hospital staff, they would be assisting people who have experienced these, brutal traumas, and this would help them figure out how they can relate as well. So if you think about the scores as victims of trafficking and the extent of potential harm from trauma, it helps understand why these are so important. And again, we're out of the life. We know that there's trauma. We know that there's needs. So now what do we do? Victims and survivors face huge challenges, even once they have been reached and gotten out of the life. There are many basic needs even that aren't being met that need to be met. So there are lots of programs and emergency services that are within our state, and they are wonderful, but there are wait lists. There's not enough. And if you can imagine being put on a wait list during this type of crime, that is something you can't just wait for. There's also issues of substance misuse. So whether that was forced by the trafficker sometimes will force them to take substances. That way they become addicted, and then that is one more method of control. Or they could be self-medicating. If you were the individual that was sex trafficked 20 to 48 times a day, there's certain things that you might do that you wouldn't think that you would do in order to get through that. Trauma, it changes the brain, impacts short and long-term health, as we talked about, physical, mental, emotional. So there are lots of things that's going to impact relationships. That's going to impact potentially how they are able to show up initially for jobs and things like that. So we've got to understand that trauma impacts the brain. Education, they may not have even been able to complete their education. So if you're trafficked as a child, some get to complete their application or education, some do not. Some are pulled out and just trafficked full time to where they're not even in school. So then they face that as, the lack of education as a barrier to employment, for instance. Most victims have criminal charges or convictions, and a lot of that is considered forced criminality. So they were forced through their trafficker to commit certain crimes. And so that impacts potential employment, housing, transportation, child custody. Many victims have kids, so that can affect even once they're out, being able to have their children. They also are in a situation to where the community that they had, whether that was other victims of trafficking within the trafficking ring that they may have been a part of, or whatever, but their community is changing, and everybody needs a sense of community. But there's basic needs not being met, and that leads to higher rates of being re-exploited. What's Ohio's response to human trafficking? We have a lot of grassroots advocacy and victim services. Again, we talked about there not being enough. We have law enforcement task forces that are dedicated to human trafficking. We, of course, follow the federal laws, and we have state laws that mirror a lot of what the federal laws state. We also have state agency initiatives. So, for instance, the governor's Ohio Trafficking Task Force. That was started in March 2012, and it was expanded in January 2021. There are now 16 agencies that are working to identify gaps and help meet needs. Many of these initiatives that we work on with the task force work hand in hand with the grassroots organizations and then also coalitions that we have throughout the state. Here is a map of the coalitions that we have. There are 29 of them throughout the state. Every county that is has a color is actually part of a coalition. So those in white are in need of a local coalition. These coalitions serve several purposes. So they provide treatment and services locally, and then also provide education and awareness. These groups are made up of volunteers. So there's professional service providers, law enforcement, healthcare professionals, all kinds of different folks who can be on all different ends of the spectrum with care for trafficking victims. And they are all part of these coalitions. The communities that are most effectively addressing human trafficking are those that take a local, multidisciplinary approach to combating sex and labor trafficking. Here's some other resources and tools that can provide information if you're looking for additional information about human trafficking. The National Human Trafficking Hotline does have their own website, and they have a wonderful amount of awareness information, data. You can break it down by state. There's a lot of great information on there that I highly encourage you to look at. Polaris actually oversaw the National Human Trafficking Hotline until recently, but they still have their own website that has a lot of great information too. And then the Governor's Ohio Human Trafficking Task Force has a website as well. And that website's great for all things Ohio. So it has a map of the coalitions that they keep up to date. You can download public awareness information. You get to look at the different laws, and as they may change, they're updated there. There's data and reports. They do monthly updates. So there's a lot of great information on that website. Other ways that you could get involved in the fight against human trafficking, what you're doing today is step number one, educating yourself, because then you can also share the information that you've learned with others. And knowledge goes a long way with prevention. And that's ultimately what we want, right? We want to be able to prevent. If you be aware of your surroundings, if you see something, say something. So many of us have our eyes on our phones as we are out and about, which is going to prevent us from seeing the things that are happening around us and may prevent us from being able to reach out and assist a victim. So it's really important that we're aware of our surroundings and making sure that we, again, know what we're looking for. And if something doesn't seem right, going ahead and saying something, which is reporting. We could volunteer and or support anti-trafficking efforts. You could do that even by joining your local coalition, because that's where a lot of these grassroots organizations come together and meet. So you'd be able to see like what organizations are throughout your community. Maybe you want to volunteer your time, or maybe you want to provide financial support, or both. All of the above is great. You could become a mentor. So we talked about the vulnerabilities that can cause somebody to be a targeted victim for traffickers. And these vulnerabilities are often there because of a lack of a strong support system. So becoming a mentor is also a great way in helping with prevention. We talked about how we are consumers. You know, we talked about coffee as an example. She has a name as an organization here in the state of Ohio that created a wonderful idea about, it's called the hierarchy of needs. So if we are lessening the demand, as I talked about before, if we lessen what we're buying and consuming, then we help lessen exploitation. So at times where you may need something, but it's not something that you would utilize all the time, maybe you can borrow that from somebody or swap it with something that somebody else needs. Maybe you can thrift. That's one of my favorite ways to reduce demand, is by, if there's something that I need, going to the thrift store and seeing if I can find it there. Maybe you make something that you need as a short term or long-term help. Last of all, we consume or we buy. And following this hierarchy of needs really helps reduce that demand. You can be a conscientious and informed consumer by looking at supply chain tracing. So the Department of Labor has a website that will provide you information about if you're getting ready to purchase something, if child or forced labor was used in that supply chain. And that is a great way to reduce demand as well. Your phone or tablet also has access to apps that you can utilize. The Bureau of International Labor Affairs, they have a Seat and Toil app that helps you determine the same thing, that, you know, that supply chain tracing. So many of the things that we buy are made through the means of labor trafficking. So if we can reduce that, then we reduce the exploitation. And I really do want to thank everyone for taking the time, your time, to come and listen and learn. I appreciate you taking this seriously, and I wanted to open it up to see if anybody has any questions. And also state, if you are not comfortable asking any questions through the webinar, my email address is here as well, and I'd be happy to answer any questions afterwards too.
Thank you for the very informative presentation. We do have questions for you in the question box. One is an individual who said, I had a waitress who had a black eye. What should I have done in that case?
If you were able to ask if she was okay, if anybody had done something that caused her harm, and you felt that it was safe, she didn't seem like maybe she was nervous and somebody may be around that is monitoring her, that can be a great way to just see if maybe an accident had happened, or if she seemed nervous, maybe providing her contact information for assistance. Like we talked about, the National Human Trafficking Hotline number, if you feel that that would be appropriate. If it's not, and that's the number she calls, they're going to get her to the appropriate place. So I do highly suggest maybe slipping back to somebody if they do seem like something is wrong and it seems safe to do so for both you and them.
Next question. I've heard that big events like the Arnold Classic are high-risk targets for trafficking. Are there certain signs of trafficking that stand out at these types of events that we could look out for?
You'll still be looking for similar signs and indicators and just the overall picture of things not seeming right. But yes, you are absolutely correct that the larger events bring in more people, and traffickers look at that as an opportunity to get more business. So just like the other businesses in the community. So there are more instances of trafficking during that time period.
Next question. We see people say there are hand gestures people show in public that's supposed to be giving you a signal they need help. They're being held against their will. Is there a resource we can use to view all the hand signals and such for someone in need?
The hand signal that you're talking about, can you see me? Okay. The hand signal that you're probably referring to is the one where maybe behind their back. It's supposed to represent that somebody needs help. The issue is just as lots of you may not have seen or heard that before. The victims often haven't seen or heard of that either. So any type of signal that somebody looks to be trying to, they're trying to make that is catching your attention, I would pay attention to. I don't think that there's really going to be a list that's going to be helpful, because the victims probably don't have access to that list.
One person has asked for a copy of the map on slide 47. So could you share that with us, or maybe the entire PowerPoint, we could send it out to everyone?
Yes, I can absolutely do that.
Okay, and then we have another comment that came in. I was out to eat with family and noticed a teenage/early 20s male with a much older male. They did not speak much to each other, and the younger male seemed not to look around and kept his eyes on the table. I still think about that. What should I have done in that situation? I was hoping he might go to the bathroom or break away, that I could get a chance to speak to him.
First, I want to state that it was great that you noticed, you're aware of your surroundings and noticed that something didn't seem right. Secondly, looking for an opportunity to potentially talk to him was great. Not being able to do that, if you were seeing signs that you felt just didn't seem right, you can go ahead and text the National Human Trafficking Hotline and describe what you're seeing, state where you're at, and they can send out people who are trained to be able to take it from there. You do not have to be correct. There's never a 100% sure way of knowing if a situation is what it could be. And so if you were to call and they send out people who are trained in this and can check, the worst case scenario, somebody's time is taken up briefly. The best case scenario, you were correct and a victim has been reached. So don't be afraid if you are looking at a situation as a whole and it just doesn't seem right, to text or call that number, which will be provided as well, so that you guys have that. And they'll, like I said, they'll take it from there.
Well, there's no more questions, but there is an awful lot of thank yous to you, Tara, for giving this wonderful presentation, and they really appreciate the professionalism with which you delivered this extremely difficult but important topic. So thank you from
Thank you
all
so
of
much.
us.
Thank you very much for attending.
Right. Hope everybody has a great rest of your day.